All right, today we're going to talk about new patterns of trade. So I'm going to keep it very short and sweet because I don't want to super bore you today, but we are going to talk about a couple of things. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Columbian Exchange, and the root word of the Columbian Exchange is Columbus because unfortunately Christopher Columbus gets credit for discovering the New World, but really he thought he was in China, or excuse me, India, and we'll talk about that later. But when we talk about the Columbian Exchange, this is what it's going to look like. So if you remember, you learned in Investigation 7 that Europe, the Middle East and Asia, and Africa were the Old World, and this is the New World, North America and South America. So if you look at the goods here, you can see the things that were brought to the Americas, and you can see the things that were got or received from the Americas. So if you look here, you have a large amount of diseases: livestock, sheep, pigs, horses, grains, wheat, rice, barley, peaches, pears, coffee, you name it, okay? And then when you look over here, you get things like pumpkin, squash, turkeys, peanuts, potatoes, corn, and tomatoes, okay? So, cacao, beans, vanilla, pineapples, and tobacco. So if you notice, the old world had a little bit more livestock, definitely livestock and diseases that the new world had never experienced. So when we talk about, the explorers and the conquistadors, the people who took over areas of land, when you think about Native Americans who had never seen horses before, that was probably one of the most intimidating things that they had ever experienced because they probably looked like a monster to them. So moving on, when we talk about this exchange, um, before exploration, before the Renaissance, before we were educated enough to build a ship to go across the ocean, the Eastern and Western hemispheres were very isolated. Europeans then began to trade with the Native Americans, and they would bring new foods, animals, and diseases to each place. Another thing that would be spread is ideas and religions as well. Crops changed people's diets. Diseases, so the diets thing and more food and different types of food, that was a positive for New World, Old World trade. But a downside would be the effect on the immune system of Native Americans. Native Americans were not weak people, very strong people, but the issue was that they had never experienced those diseases before. So, if a Native American gets smallpox, the likelihood of them surviving is very small. Even measles, influenza, and malaria, which you would get from mosquitoes, but they did not have the immune system to fight it. They were strong people, but you just have to think about if a disease comes and you've never experienced it before, how do you fight it? When we talk about mercantilism, it's going to be a system of trade. And so when we talk about mercantilism, it's a nation's strength depends solely or predominantly on its wealth. And here are the basic principles. A nation's strength, it depends on its wealth as measured in gold and silver. There is a set amount of wealth in the world, and nations have to compete for their share. So the nations that you would think about during this time would be Spain, Portugal, England, France, and some the Netherlands as well. And so set wealth, and they compete for this wealth. Um, when we talk about a favorable balance of trade, that means that your trade is balanced, and that means that you export more than you import, because when you export, you make money. When you import, you're spending money. So you want to be the person who has a lot of exports. In our society right now in 2016, China has more exports than they do imports, and America has more imports than they do exports. So America does not necessarily have a favorable balance of trade. Countries should limit imports and maximize imports, or exports, excuse me, which is something we just talked about. Exports are goods that you send out. Imports are goods that you bring in or you buy. All right. A country should have its own source of raw materials. Um, and so remember, we talked in previous videos about empires or countries, European countries wanting to create empires and have colonies in other areas so that they could gain raw materials. And if you remember learning about the Industrial Revolution, raw materials are essential to production. Okay? Colonies exist only as a way for the mother country to make profit. I'll give you an example. England created the 13 colonies in America. England was the mother country. The 13 colonies were the colonies, and they sent raw materials back to England so that they could make manufactured goods. countries' colonies should not trade with other countries. So the 13 colonies of England in America could not trade with France or Spain. And when we talk about mercantilism, what do you think is the goal? Okay? The answer is to increase your own power by economically weakening your foreign competitors. So England's trying to outdo Spain, Spain's trying to outdo Portugal, Portugal's trying to outdo France. They're all trying to outdo each other. So, how do you create a favorable balance of trade? First of all, you reduce the amount of imports by taxing them, and that's called a tariff. You put a tax on the import so people are less likely to import goods. You sell exports at a higher price, so manufactured goods are more expensive than raw goods. Let me give you an example. If you cut down the trees in the 13 colonies of America, those trees are going to be cheaper than when it goes to England and becomes a cabinet. The cabinet will be more expensive. Countries help people to start new businesses by giving them money. These are called subsidies. And a country can control overseas sources of raw materials and precious metals. So basically, like I like to look at colonies as like the children of the mother country, and these kids are sending the money back to their mom and dad, which eventually colonies are going to get angry about. When we talk about capitalism, it's when private individuals control the economy and compete to make a profit. So, colonies began to supply their mother countries with raw materials, and then the mother country would manufacture the good and sell it at a higher price. Example, starts like this in America. Okay, it is shipped, and it ends like this in England. Which is more expensive? Definitely the cabinets. So, joint stock companies, individual investors, that's part of capitalism is making your own private ventures or business ventures. And so, individual investors they would pull their money together with other people and to fund a large business. So, investors buy a share. Let me give you an example. It is way more expensive if Miss McRae wanted to own her own cupcake business and I only had one person who would invest and it was like my dad. Okay? Whereas if the business does well, me and my dad will get a lot of the money. But if it doesn't do well, my dad and I are both out of the money. But if I have a joint stock company, and let's say I open a cupcake business and my dad puts in a little bit of money, my aunt does, the bank, maybe a couple other people who believe in my business, it's a joint stock, so you don't lose as much if you lose, but you still have a lot to gain. So investors buy shares. If profitable, each shareholder receives a percentage of the profit that they put in. If unprofitable, each shareholder only loses what they put in. So you have less of a risk if you go in jointly on something. Now, we're going to talk about the Atlantic slave trade. A couple things I want to talk to you about real quick. Why were African slaves suited for America? Let me give you an example here. Native Americans, their immune systems were low. They did not have the best ways physically to fight sickness. And so, one thing that they did is that they decided that African slaves were suited for the Americas because Africans had already interacted with Europeans as well as Asians, so they had immunities. Also, Africans were strong individuals physically. They were built a little bit bigger, a little bit taller, and stronger. So, the reason that African slaves were traded is because they were considered or deemed a better individual for the workload of colonies because colonies had plantations and farms and they needed to, produce raw materials for their mother countries. Now, when we talk about African slaves, a lot of times people have a misconception that African slaves were chased around Africa and caught. But what you have to understand is that Muslims, which North Africa had many Muslim kings, um, Muslims traded African slaves along the Silk Road and all types of trade routes, but also African kingdoms would conquer other African tribes and trade those conquered tribes for guns and manufactured goods. So plantations are going to become popular and they produce large amounts of cash crops like tobacco, sweet potatoes, things like that. What is a cash crop? It's a crop that makes you money, lots of money, all right? And so most slaves came from the west coast of Africa. Slaves would be kidnapped by powerful African tribes and sold to Europeans for guns and other goods, manufactured goods, rum, cabinetry, trinkets, gold, you name it, they were trading for the slaves. So you have to understand is that African tribes would be like even probably Mansa Musa had other tribes that he conquered and made them slaves for his kingdom, so they would be traded. This trade became known as triangular trade, and the leg between Africa and the Americas was known as Middle Passage. Middle Passage could last from 6 to 3 months, or 6 weeks to 3 months. It was a long voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to be dropped off in either South America, North America, or the Caribbean, just based off of who was running the ship. So if you had the Spaniards, they would send more of their people to South America, whereas England would take their slaves to North America because that's where their colonies were established. Middle Passage was not a pleasant voyage. Slaves were treated less than humans, and so they kind of treated them like they were considered animals or less than. So they would all be chained together, things like that. When you look here, and you need to add this to your map. In the 18th century, this is what the Atlantic slave route looked like, or the Atlantic slave trade, or triangular trade, because it does form a triangle. Manufactured goods left Europe and were sent to Africa. Africa produced the slaves and sent them to the Americas, and raw materials were sent from the Americas back to Europe. Once again, I want to remind you this is the leg of Middle Passage. When we talk about Middle Passage, conditions in the Middle Passage were very terrible for slaves. They were packed in tight spaces. So this is the floor plan of what a cargo ship holding slaves would look like. Bottom floor here. This is a side view. So here's a area where the ship slaves are kept, and right here as well, below deck. And then another row of slaves here, which will be on top. And if you can see here, you can see where their bodies were laid next to each other. You have to understand, guys, that this was not a pleasant trip. You know, they would come down with a ladle of food and bring the food to their mouths. Whatever bodily fluids or anything that they experienced, seasickness, death, anything like that, they would be chained to each other. So if someone was sick next to you, you laid in sickness. And so that was just part of it. And that is unfortunate that slaves were treated this way, especially being pulled away from their continent or their home area and not knowing English or being able to experience or understand what is truly going on with them. If you look here, this is a newspaper article from Harper's Weekly, so you can see all the slaves sitting on the deck, and they would bring them on deck for brief periods of time to get some air and some sun. Sometimes, if slaves were chained together and some died, a large amount died, they would just throw the rest of them overboard that were chained to them. The trip usually lasted between 3 to 6 weeks, could last longer, maybe 3 months, depending on the ship, storms, things like that. About 10 to 20% of slaves did not survive Middle Passage. When we talk about slavery in the colonies, you know, the Atlantic slave trade, a lot of times we have this misconception that North America and the 13 colonies were receiving the most slaves, but if you look closely, Brazil was, which Brazil was conquered by the Portuguese, which you've learned in another video. But if you look, you can see who had a large amount of slave ships. Like the Netherlands, they're the Dutch. They didn't really have that many slaves because they had the tea trade in India and South Africa. If you look here, you can look at the percentage. 6% went to the United States, but the Caribbean had 40% where they could produce sugar and molasses. Brazil had 38%. So Caribbean, you know, you got to think about Central America and the islands. You see a couple maps here. And so most slaves worked on plantations, some worked as craftsmen. Slaves were considered property and they had no rights. It was hard for slaves to resist owners during this time. You know, they tried to keep their traditions alive. And a lot of them turned to religion. Some revolted. You know, we're going to have the Underground Railroad where they're going to escape and get to freedom. And occasionally they would try to run away and start their own communities. So if you look here, images of them working with sugarcane. Slaves often endured brutal treatment or abuse. So a lot of times slave masters would abuse slaves and openly punish them in front of people to make an example of them. But also during this time, plantation masters, viceroys, whoever was running these colonies or these plantations ruled by fear. And they did not allow slaves to be educated because we know, if anything in world history, with education comes intelligence, and with intelligence comes with revolutions, because people can be unhappy and they can organize and they're logical and they can fight whatever they don't like. And so when we talk about slavery, you know, they did not want slaves to learn to read. They did not want slaves to learn to write. They did not want slaves to mutiny or organize. And so they tried to keep them as uneducated as possible. And we realized, and we know later, that this would not last forever. And this is something that people would begin to fight, and they would educate slaves, and slaves would revolt. And also we would have the Civil War in the 1860s. So when we talk about African diaspora, we want to talk about the diffusion of African culture, including music, art, religion, and food throughout the Western world. And so you'll have foods, dances, clothing, things like that, that they will all share together. And that what you have to understand is that pretty much when I think about the diffusion is that African culture became part of the American, South American, North American, and the Caribbean part of the culture. Um, it's not, Africans did not come over here in the best way, but their culture has become part of the countries and areas that they live in. Please make sure you have your notes filled in for me.